Alrighty, this is our last talk of the year. We're going to leave off in the middle of things. It'll be a very short talk, probably an hour, no more. And it's one of those talks that it would probably be best to take as a story instead of as outright factual. All right. A lot of what we experience in life has an effect on us that we don't even realize. Like, for example, we all know about subliminal things where they, in the midst of a movie or something like that, they'll flash images in that you don't even see. They're happening so quickly. And there are some things that are so subtle that we don't recognize that they're there. But it's also a matter that very obvious things that we experience in day-to-day life also has an effect on us. For example, what kind of locale you live in has a big effect on your consciousness. You know, whether you live in the mountains, or whether you live on the seashore, or whether you live out in the barren desert. It's not just a matter of that you have to hunt if you live in the mountains, and that you have to fish if you live on the seashore. If you live out in a prairie, you cultivate. It's not just that, it's just the presence of the mountains. That if you take a trip across the country and do it in a reasonably short period of time and see what happens to your consciousness as you go from locale to locale, and then see how the aborigines were that were in those locales, and see how the different settlers were that were in those locales, and you see that there is a relationship between the consciousness of the individual and the terrain that they lived in. So very obvious things affect us, and we're not even aware of it. I'm sure that if you told a mountain man that a lot of his attitudes were what they were just because he looked at mountains every day instead of looking at waves every day, the mountain man would very likely laugh at you because he wouldn't be aware of those kinds of effects. The same is true with even more obvious things. That if we look at the sun and if we look at the moon, these are really stand out, obvious things that affect our consciousness. And so it's not surprising that the sun standing there as one singular bright object would be seen as the center of divinity. Or the moon, which would be isolated, because you could look at the moon, it would be associated with more of a personal kind of light. It would be something singular that you could identify with, but it wouldn't be glaring at you. So what I'm trying to say is that when we look at the sun or toward the sun every day, or when we look at the moon every day, just the fact that we're seeing that one thing in isolation relative to when we look at the earth, we don't even differentiate all the blades of grass. When we see that one thing in isolation, it affects our consciousness, and it makes us more keenly aware of things that are separate, that are individual, and that are standalone, unique. Okay. Now, if we look at the entire solar system in the same way that we've been trying to in the recent talks when we talked about the births of the planets and things like that, and the harmonics that produced them and the whirlpools in which they solidified, we have something similar. We're talking about the physical body of God being located in these isolated balls that are being hurled through space. But the same thing happens when instead of looking out at something individual, it happens much more pronouncedly if we are all alone in ourselves looking out. See, we've been talking about the whole first half of evolution. When we began this all, before we were even immersed in the rarest of spiritual worlds, which turned out to be a very deep immersion, before that, we were so unified with the divine, we were inseparable from the divine, and we were unself-conscious. We had no objectivity of any kind. And so we've been following then through the various periods of evolution, the Saturn period, the Sun period, the Moon period, and the first 3.5 revolutions of the Earth period, and the first 2 epochs of the 4th revolution of the Earth period. We've been looking at a process where there's been greater and greater and greater differentiation, greater and greater consolidation, condensation, solidification, and differentiation into different types or different kinds of experience. So the whole first half of evolution is becoming more and more isolated in a myriad of forms of isolation. So we've been talking about these islands, which is a good way of looking at planets. We've been talking about the way these islands have been formed in a sea of space. The exact times when each planet was differentiated are not clearly given. It's stated that when Uranus was differentiated, we were still in the chaos coming out at the beginning of the Earth period, with the first of the Saturn revolution of the Earth period. But we are talking about now the differentiation of the Earth. Now, last time we talked about a principle that is a very important principle, and that is that what happens in the macrocosm is paralleled in the microcosm. We said that the differentiation of planets led to the differentiation of individual human consciousness. We also went so far as to say that human beings are creative parts of this activity. That is, it was our work of reliving the archetype or of the plan for this period of evolution. As we experienced it in our consciousness, we brought it into effect. So there are 2 streams of consciousness that we live in. One is like the perception of it as it's happening, which is like looking at the sun and moon and being affected by it. The other is creatively giving ourselves to that activity and causing changes so that everything goes parallel. So there are 2 streams of activity, one an inpouring of sensory experience, and 2 an outpouring of creative experience. The 2 work hand in hand, and that's where our consciousness developed. All right. We talked about different planets forming. Clearly, the outer planets must have, we said that they had to have separated first, and they must have separated earlier, because most of the outer planets are frozen gases. They're much more when the Earth was more nebulous and much more vague and much closer to chaos. Whereas the inner planets, the Earth and within, are metallic cored planets. And they obviously had to have occurred very late in the differentiation process. Okay, I'm working with brand new notes, and it's always difficult for me, so you're going to have to bear with me. And we'll have to go slowly. All right, and we talked about human differentiation before the Earth was separated within the revolving solar mass. And we said that when we were still part of the large more etheric globe of the solar system, which as it began to spin and condense, flattened down and threw off within itself. As the energy retreated inward more and more, it threw off the planets within itself. But we were already recapitulating in this fourth revolution, we were recapitulating the Saturn period and the Sun period in the epochs that were called the Polarian and the Hyperborean epochs of time. And we went through, we recapitulated mineral-like states and we recapitulated plant-like states, except that we were human beings all the way along in those states. We wouldn't recognize ourselves as human beings right now because our consciousness was so much different and our form was obviously much different than it is now. But we were human beings in that we had a threefold spirit and a threefold body and a becoming connecting link between the vehicles of experience versus the vehicles of spiritual creativity. Now we're going to talk about the period of time that is called Lemuria. And it'll be just a very brief rendition. And we're going to take it like a story. Lemuria, then, is a recapitulation of what we have called in the past the moon period. And in the moon period, we went through the animal-like existence. And also toward the latter half of the moon period, we developed the threefold spirit. By adding the last link, the human spirit, which was a conception of self, we developed an individuality. Also, we developed in the animal-like state a separate existence. Because an animal can separate itself from the main body of things, because it can have its own individual motivations, that experience, like the trees and the rocks are in the ball of the earth. The microcosm is very inseparable from the macrocosm. The minerals and the chemicals that are evolving are inseparable from the general body. And the trees sort of pull away from the physical body, but they're always attached to it. But an animal, especially a bird, can fly and feel the independence and recognize that kind of selfhood. And it has a personal motivation, even if it's a specialized personal motivation so that all lions are alike and all eagles are alike. It's still an individualized emotion rather than just having a blur of a continuous life. Because if you look at the plants, it's all the same life that is in the plants. All it does is grow and grow and grow. You can take and graft one plant onto another. Okay, so we noted that the moon period, we'll remember that the moon period was a period then of great individual differentiation. Even that which was to become the planets in the Earth period, which we're discussing now, was differentiated in the solar system back in the moon period as some kind of vague moon within the sun. It's not like our moon in the heavens, which is a satellite of our Earth, but it was a moon within the sun that was later to become the planets. So there is a great deal of differentiation, and this gets recapitulated in the. Remember that we're in the fourth revolution of the Earth period, and we're on the fourth globe now. We are on what you might say, the epitome of materialization and externalization and differentiation, and everything is being separated all the more. So one would expect that the first images of an individuality and a personality would be developed in humanity, which is the most highly differentiated of all of the evolving kingdoms on the earth right now. So it's not surprising that we find it at that time. Okay, now we're going to look sort of at a picture of what's happening with the earth. And we're going to look at, it's going to be one of these things that we focus more and more clearly. And the next time that we meet, which will be all the way next fall, then we're going to look into more of the inner meanings, and we'll take one more talk and maybe two on this, because a lot of very crucial information is to be looked at in Lemuria, because it's sort of the beginning of humans as humans, and there are a lot of really difficult things that have to be observed. So first we'll get a rough view of the experience. And so then we're saying that in the Lemurian times, the solar system, which had been becoming a sun and planets, was drawing more and more inward, and while doing so, leaving behind the spinning planets. And when the Earth was differentiated, it was consolidating out of the ethers. And the whole energy, you might say, and energy is a reasonably good word, the whole energy of the solar cosmos was very high. It hadn't really cooled down. So you could see the early Earth as a spinning body of very, very hot but condensing ether within the revolving solar system. And gradually it cooled, and as it cooled, it became material in the sense that we know the physical elements, the solids, the liquids, and the gases, but it was still glowing hot with heat from the higher energy state, from the friction as well. And as it cooled, it began slowly to encrust. But it didn't do it all really easily. And obviously it stratified, with the denser things seeking the center, and the lighter things, like what we call our continents now, are really just a light slag. They're called, the geological word for them is Ciel. Because there's a high prevalence of minerals that are silicon and aluminum. And the continents are Ciel material as opposed to Sima material, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So roughly they're slag, like all of our feldspars and things like that are aluminum compounds, and all of our sand and quartz and such like that are silicon compounds. So there was a stratification. The lighter stuff floated out, and the metals and the heavier materials went more to the center of the ball. And something very similar took place. Well, I should mention other things. There's all of the water, which gradually was, this was all mixed up to begin with. It begins just the same way like chaos. In chaos, everything is all one, and then gradually the differentiation process and the separation process takes place. Everything is always parallel, but it's parallel on another level, and it becomes more and more beautiful as it goes on, seeing how the same principles occur on level after level of manifestation. Like, for example, the water was in a vaporous state, and it was scattered throughout, and it would just vented itself, and for a large part of the history of our globe, a lot of the gaseous elements surrounded the globe, and water was in a gaseous state, and we were not too dissimilar in some regards from Venus, or as Venus is right now. We were never quite that high a temperature as Venus constantly, but all the vapor, we were hidden behind a cloud, and we're going to have a lot to say about that as we go on. And so as the surface of the Earth crystallized, we talked about this last time, that as things go from a more spiritual state to a more material state, they migrate from the poles to the equator. And as you get more toward the equator, things become more formal. And so then, the Earth was solidifying, and it was coating over, and there were like first just islands of CL. You know, instead of just whole big continents, there were just islands. But in one area, things began to collect much more than others, and it was a huge big island, and it worked its way down to the equator, and it was, just think of the pictures of this, it was so eccentric, it was so hardened much more than the other parts of the surface that the Earth was an eccentric ball, wobbling. And as it spun, the more this well-ahead island solidified, the more closer it got to the equator, the more there was the eccentric quality, until eventually that island was thrown off. Now, mind you, we're talking only about the physical part of it. Now, it's interesting to note that astronomers have several theories about the birth of the moon. This is an occult view of the birth of the moon. In fact, the seers go so far as to say that after the moon was taken off from the surface of the Earth, or was spun off or thrown off, this is much different than the Earth being differentiated within the solar system. You could say that the Earth was thrown off of the sun, but what it really was, it was thrown off within the sun as the sun was concentrating in. But in the case of the moon was actually thrown off. Now, among modern astronomers and cosmologists, there are three theories to the origin of the moon. The most believable to them theory is that as the Earth was differentiated within the nebula, that there were two nuclei, and that they both formed coetaneously, and that the moon was formed before, a little bit before the sun, and was formed independently, then a little bit before the Earth, and was formed independently of the Earth, and has continued around it in a binary orbit. Another theory is that the moon is a captured body, like a meteorite or something like that. And the third, least believable to modern science, is the view that the moon was thrown off from the Earth. However, if you look at a description, the scientific papers of how the Earth would have been if the moon had been thrown off from it, especially the fact that this cool body thrown off, when it was thrown off, the general temperature of the Earth would have risen, and the whole surface of the Earth, which was beginning to encrust, would have remelted. This is precisely the way the seers describe it, exactly the way material scientists would say that it would have to have taken place. The conditions as described by the seers are much more ethereal than the conditions that are described by science. Though science is not completely antagonistic to those ideas. Like, for example, science recognizes that even such heavy things as iron can live in a pure energy state before it is even crystallized into iron, because you can see that in stars that are nothing but a plasma of energy, if you look at the spectrum, there is in that plasma an iron. It's a gaseous iron. It's a plasma iron, but it is there. And so the ideas of modern materialistic science and modern spiritual science are not completely divergent from each other. So, all right, so the moon is differentiated from the Earth, but then clearly, because it's a spinning body, the tendency would be for the stuff to float and evenly disperse itself. But if a glob forms and comes down to the equator and is pulled off, if it uniformly hardens and becomes a continent and throws itself off or ejects itself off or is thrown off by the main body, it would mean then all the rest of the CL, the continents that were floating, and the rest of the Earth would now still be eccentric. And so there was at one time what geologists call Gondwana land, where all of the continents that we know now were united as one, and that the Americas have separated and have gone one way, and this is like there is a continuous drift, like it's measurable, that you can see that the west coast of United States is getting further and further away from the west coast of Europe. This is measured by very accurate measurements. And so the Earth is trying to right itself and balance itself. But mind you, all of the trends that we're talking about that have been going on since the differentiation of the planet are still continuing now. The Earth is still trying to balance itself. It's still trying to rectify itself. And to a large extent, the condensation process is still taking place. The release of energy from inside of the Earth in terms of volcanoes and such like that still goes on, and the Earth is still very fluid. It's almost like a hot, squishy ball with just the skin on it. All right, so we're looking then at a process that took place in the development of the Earth itself. And we're going to do a little bit more of description, and that's all the further we're going to get tonight. So everything then began on a hypermaterial level and became more and more solid. And the differentiation became greater in everything that evolved. Now, mind you, when we're talking about this, we're talking about not an overnight process, but we're talking about millions and millions of years. Now, the same thing is true, the same principle that we talked about last time, that human development goes hand in hand with the creation. So, as these islands, including the one that was ejected or rejected, as these islands were forming, our ability to condense the creative, controlling forces of the Spirit and bring them into our personality, as that was increasing, you might say that we were a causal factor in the differentiation of the planets, in the hardening of the planets, and in the changes within the planet itself. We are part of the creation. So, what's taking place is, if you could look with an inner eye, in the same way that substance is congealing out of this energy state or this hypermatter state, and it's molten, but yet it's cooling and beginning to harden, within that, the human beings were also, from a very etheric state, beginning to congeal and beginning to solidify. And so, like our Lemurian kind of experience, early Lemurian kind of experience, wasn't at all what we would expect of a human being. You know, like we were still very, our form was very large, as it often happens in our high-pressure, hot system. The physical form is very large, but it wasn't at all differentiated. It was almost amoeba-like. And we obviously had to be careful that we weren't disintegrated by all of this energy. This is why we had to be separated within the sun in the first place, because if we had stayed with the sun, there would have been more energy than our very slow evolution could have taken, and we would have just been disintegrated all the time, in the same way that if, like you put something like an African violet in the sun, it just, the sun just kills it. It withers away, and you put something in the hot desert sun, and it rots in no time. And that sort of thing would have happened with our consciousness. We couldn't stand the high energy of the sun. And so we were subject to the heat of the earth at that time, and so we sort of had to float around and maneuver ourselves as acts of will to keep our physical bodies from being disintegrated. Even though we didn't feel any feelings in them, there was something like an animal instinct to know that something was not to our good, because as animals can avoid predators that they can't even perceive. They know that there's danger, or they sense that there's danger, even without having the perception and the individual differentiation to know exactly what's going on. So we want to clear up a few illusions. One of the illusions is that Lemuria, rather than a period of time, was a specific place. Most people who are of that ilk think that Lemuria was an island that was right here between Madagascar and India and Indonesia. And I think it was a place, like some people think that Atlantis was a place. But what we're saying is that early Lemuria was wherever there was an island in the encrusting earth. Wherever it was possible to manifest externally at all, that was where Lemuria was. Lemuria was primarily a period of time that had much more rapid change than the change that we have now. Things go at a snail's pace now because everything is so hard and everything is so immobile. Everything is indeed frozen now. Another conception that we have to, misconception that we have to relieve ourselves of is that you read in a lot of books, the Lemurians were just like us, except that they were much more magical and they were much more attuned to things, and they did all kinds of magical wonders. And some folks could even imagine that the Lemurians could wear blue jeans. It's not that at all. When we were the Lemurians, were these hyper-material beings that were very, very vague in our consciousness, having only a sense of danger or a sense of beginning to become personally aware. Again, remember this personal awareness. We were identified with the earth, and we were identified with the islands of silicon aluminum on the earth, and this had the effect of isolating us. Looking from the inside out, it's just the same thing that we said earlier. Looking at the sun or at the moon isolated gives us a unique conception of divinity as a one central focus of things. But if we ourselves are identified with an island, what we're saying is that if a person grew up on an island and only had that small little teeny island, like a Robinson Crusoe, like the consciousness and the self-consciousness that would develop would be very, very unique. It would be extremely egocentric, which reminds me of a joke that I just saw. It was really cute. It was a cartoon. And it's this man that washes up on a desert island, and all there is on the desert island is a hill and there's one palm. And as he walks onto the island, he sees a signboard. And on the signboard is the picture of the island, which you can see totally. And there's the palm there. And there's an arrow that says, You are here. But the conception then of dawning unique individuality and personality was taking place. We were not even yet thinkers. We were much more feelers than we were thinkers. But we still were humans. We were animal humans. Now we have to recapitulate another idea that we've had all along. And that is that we're useful. Everything is useful in the cosmos. Everything has a service that it offers to the cosmos, no matter what its state of evolution. The plants give us life, an abundance of life. The animals give us moods and feelings. And the minerals give us form. So when we were in the Lemurian period becoming human, we were recapitulating an animal-like state, and we were animal human beings. We were human beings and we were not animals. This is something that's very different now from the occult conception of things, from the scientific, materialistic conception of things. The materialistic conception has a blind evolution, that things just happen and that organization produces different kinds of organizations with greater and greater sophistication, but that there is no purpose and that there is no end to it. It was started by a random event, and meaning is just an organization that came out of something random. And the changes in forms also happen according to mutations or sudden hits by missiles in space and such like that, and that it isn't a meaningful organization. Now, the thing where spiritual science is very different than material science is that on the Earth, in the Earth period, the things that we're talking about with fossil records, from a spiritual point, even the stuff that the fossil records are in are fossils. Because there isn't such a thing as pure, untouched matter. All matter has given form to some kind of life existence. And the remembrance of that life existence, even though it has been gone through like a metamorphic rock stage, is still within the matter of stuff. But from the spiritual point of view, the claims of the seers are that we didn't evolve from animals, but that animals evolved from us. Just the other way around. We didn't come out of the animals, but the animals came out of us. Now, this is a very, very interesting conception, and we're going to look at that some. We were recapitulating as human beings an animal-like stage. But we started with the form being very simple, like almost amoeba-like. No organs or no sense perception or anything like that. We were very, very generalized. But if you remember, in the moon period, which corresponds to Lemuria, we went through our animal-like existence. And in our animal-like existence, we floated in the solar system, probably within the etheric structure of that globe, and we went through, because we were developing our desire bodies, we went through a metamorphosis and evolution of feelings, sort of like one chord of music will resolve into another, and it'll carry you along in a feeling. We went through our animal-like existence, developing different forms, but that those forms were expressions of feelings. And with feeling comes the first self-expression. And you remember that when we said in the moon period we had these cosmic shrieks and cries, and that we expressed those very primitive desires or feelings or motivations, that we expressed them out into the cosmos. Very much probably like in a similar way now, coyotes bay and birds sing and such like that. It was just a simple, raw expression of feeling. Now, when we get to this Lemurian period, as we're condensing, we're recapitulating all of these emotions. Now, each of these emotions is a complex entity in itself, because each animal is a complete complex entity in itself, and each animal has a species kind of mood. And so the same thing happened with us. As we evolved or re-evolved this kind of emotion, we came to outgrow that. And when we outgrew it, it was very much like the same way that when we objectified it and said, well, I'm not this, I've outgrown that. You know, I'm putting this in very logical terms now. It was a much, much more subconscious kind of activity than that. But in the same way that the earth said, I cannot be this hard, I have to throw this off, because to be the earth, I cannot be the earth. Because you recognize that all these balls that are in space are also the bodies of very great beings. Like the earth and Mars and such like that are bodies of great beings, and there are beings within beings, as well as all the creatures like the minerals and such like that. But the earth was saying, I cannot, to be what I need to be, I can't have this hardening going on, so it threw the moon off. We're going to come to the spiritual meaning behind all of the things that we're just roughly describing physically now in the next talk. But as we experienced one mood after another, we outgrew that, and it's very much like our personal growth is now. We say, I can't be that anymore. And we repulse and we throw off this form of existence, this form of emoting that we've had. And when we did that with the power of sound. And we ejected these emotions, which in themselves were somewhere between desire material and etheric material and proto-matter. And as we threw off these different moods, they became the forms of the animals. They were very vague. They were like, we didn't say achoo and spit off a wolf with hair and digestive system and fangs and such like that. But some of the earlier conceptions were like just outpourings. I am this. And when you say that you're something, you also say that you're not it at the same time. And what was our awful was also our creation. So that this was a creative process as well as a throwing off process. That's a general spiritual principle that is indicated by Scorpio in the same way that what we can't use, what is horrible stuff that we throw off as fecal matter, is also very highly creative fertilizer for other forms of life, and it is a creative activity. I don't want to go into that. It goes so far as to what people painting themselves as part of ancient rituals, painting themselves with their own fecal matter and such like that, and through that having their creative power. So we began throwing off the more primitive urges, the amoeba-like formless forms. Our form became much more refined as we threw off all of the animal-like states. All right. Obviously, some of the different, at different periods in evolution, clearly the more spineless or the more scaly creatures and the more soft creatures existed in the earlier times, whereas now we have more of the creatures that are like mice and elephants and such like that. The evolution has changed such that some of the things like the amphibians and the reptilians and such are much smaller in size and in number and in part of the economy of the earth now than they were then. So like the whole attitude of humanity has changed with that. So what would be called, like the whole life of amoeba is surrounding something and eating it. That's its whole existence. And it's propelling it, it doesn't have really much direction. It just is in one place and globs. So this is where we're going to start bringing in scriptural things now, Bible and other scriptures as well. But this is where the statement comes from in the Bible that Adam and Eve named the animals. A name is really different than a word. A name is a word given a personified quality. And so the naming of the animals is very apt. Other scriptures tell the same story. It's not quite the same way as Mark Twain in his Diaries of Adam and Eve describes this whole thing. He had his own notions about it, and Mark Twain was rather sexist about things. And Adam comes home and he says, well, he writes in his diary, she did it to me again today. She brought this creature to me and she said, we'll call this a cow. And Adam says to Eve, why do you want to call it a cow? And she says, it looks like a cow, doesn't it? And that was sort of a game that Mark Twain played, but it really wasn't that far from the truth, because there was something almost approaching a tautology. There was a logic to a word that gets thrown off, and the word and the form, it's very much like the ancients believed, who still had magical powers. Now, when we're talking about magical powers, the Lemurians, because they had all of this energy available to them, and because they were very pure, and because they were developing the creative mind, even though it wasn't anywhere near indwelling yet, they had all of this creative ability. So that if they spoke a word, if they shouted out and spewed out a form like that of an animal, it had the ability to live. The creative hierarchies, the gods worked through us that in our becoming human, or becoming fully human, and throwing off everything that wasn't human in ourselves, we actually brought about the creation of the prototypes for the animals. And that as the forms that we threw off became more and more refined, the evolution of the animals followed along. It wasn't all that rapid, but you've got to remember when we talked about stragglers and such like that, there were people that could come in at various levels, and they could be doing a lot of recapitulation to come up to different types of animal forms at the same time. So what we're saying is that it was fairly easy, because there was so much energy and there was so much power. In fact, it was even easier before there was Adam and Eve. It was easier when there was just Adam. Because if we look in the Hebrew, one of the meanings of the word ADM, is human of red earth. And that's just what the earth was. It was still red hot. It was still glowing. And the human beings at that time were like it. They were a much more energetic state. But you realize now that, especially after the moon is thrown off and there's an objectification of over-rapid crystallization, and the earth is cooling down, and we, in our creative activity, are coming into the earth, we couldn't continue as we did. We had, we had a physical body, and we had externality, because most of these moods and such that we were throwing off, we were in a much more internal state, in a much more subjective state. And in that subjective state, we were differentiating in an inward way. It would be very much like sitting there and going through like a moving meditation, or going through like a moving changes of mood. But when you get into the world of externality, when things start becoming turgid and hardened and even crystallized, ossified, as things are now, you have to continue existence. Because if we're to experience on the material world, we have to have a body of the material world. And in the same way then that there was a differentiation of sun and moon, and there was a differentiation of the spirit and matter, of the spirit of the individuality and of the personality in Lemuria, there had to be, in order to even keep the status quo, there had to be a differentiation even of the bodies of human beings, and this is what is called the separation of the sexes. The sexes are just forms of experience. Because we have gotten so far into this objectification now that we have taken it materialistically, we have covered it with all kinds of illusions, and that we identify completely with the forms, that we don't realize that the forms are just things that we express through. We are so identified with the forms that we have all kinds of personal prejudices. Like we identify with being a male or a female, or we identify with a body that is black versus a body that is pink. And these are great illusions. The reality of the matter is that those are just forms of experience. In the same way that if you make a garden, you have one kind of form that is called a shovel that you turn the soil over with, and another kind that you break it up with, and another one that you rake with. These are forms of experience. And so then, part of the energy after the separation of the sexes means that there was a polarization of energy. The Bible says that Eve was made out of Adam's side. Some people interpret that to mean rib, but it means side, meaning that one side of the energy was differentiated in one way. There was an uneven kind of split, and part of the energy was then used for procreating physical bodies. The other part of the energy was used for survival of those bodies, which involved the development of an alimentary system, because we weren't any longer, when we came into the physical and had a physical existence, we couldn't just live out of the energy in the air, because we were coming into a focus that required us to have our attention in the physical, and that involved a different kind of experience. So part of the energy then was developed, because previously we had these simple bag-like bodies, and when the sexes were differentiated, we had to develop the alimentary canal, and whatever we had left over, we developed senses so we could see what was going on in the external world, and whatever else we had left over, we developed a nervous system so that eventually the spirit could come in and completely indwell in its forms and have a direct experience of the external world. So then part of the energy was shared for procreation, and the rest was spent in creative work. So obviously, at this point, the differentiation of the animal forms came much more slowly when the sexes were separated. Everything became much more slowly because everything was much harder. But some of the things, there is still this devolutionary, you might say, passing on, like hand-me-downs in a family. Some clothes would pass from child to child to child. Even the differentiation of the sexes was passed on to some of the animal kingdom. And some of it even carried all the way into the plant kingdom, so that you have things like hawthorn trees or Chinese gooseberries or things like that, where you have to have a male plant and a female plant for the form to procreate. So there is at the same time that there is a forward-going evolving of new forms, and by the throwing off of something that we aren't, there is also, in those carrying along there, the refinements from the new forms are eventually adapted to the older forms and carry into them. So, okay, this is what our work was. We're just about all done. We have seen now that there is a polarization and a differentiation. We started out talking about looking at the sun versus looking at the moon. The same thing happened in us. Part of our consciousness was associated with that moon that was differentiated, and it was used for hardening bodies. Part of it was used for bringing in new creative life into those bodies so that we could improve them, so that we could evolve them. We became more and more human-like as we threw off more and more of our animal-like qualities. As we did so, our consciousness approached human-like consciousness that it is now. The earth, at the same time, was becoming more and more solid. It was still covered with water vapor. Early on, some of the things like the methane and such like that, when there was a recapitulation of bacterial-like stages, that was taken care of, and there was a metamorphosis that took place there. But this is a picture, this is a story of what the Lemurian epoch was like. Obviously, it's something that runs many millions of years. It's something where we recapitulated an animal-like state from single-celledness to something approximating a human-like form. Whether that human-like form was something like our current lemurs that live in Madagascar and places like that, I don't know. I don't know if that's the case when the separation of the sexes occurred, whether it was like that. Obviously, the differentiated male and female bodies have also moved forward. So I don't believe that we could have, that our bodies were anything like that. So we saw that our creative work was recapitulating our emotions and developing the animal-like spirits. Now, we've looked at the roughest and the most exterior things. Now, next time we have to deal with very, very difficult subjects. We have to deal with the problem of evil. And we have to deal with the problem of failure. And in the past, we've had to deal with differential attainment. But now we're going to have to deal with some really difficult things. And we're going to start introducing some more new concepts. And we're going to talk about this material from a more of a moral soul growth and what was taking place in our consciousness, what the intention was, what the result was, why the difference was as it is, and that's going to be leading up to our current time. And so in the next two talks, or at least the next one talk, we'll talk about Lemuria and then move on to Atlantis. This works out very nicely because it will be, if people do want to sink into the middle of this course next fall, it will at least be something that will be interesting. Rather than talking about periods that nobody's ever heard of before, they'll at least be able to hear about Lemuria. All right, that is all that we have for tonight. It was only about an hour, wasn't it? 58 minutes. Great. And so next time we'll have much more juicy kind of principles, introducing more principles rather than ramifying on the old ones. Yeah. No, it'll actually be September. We'll start earlier next year because I want to be all done with this course the next time around. About a year from now, it'll be finished. Because after that, we move on to a whole new thing, and that is all kinds of things for spiritual self-betterment and actually doing the creative thing. When we get to part 3 of all of this year and next year will be part 2 and part 3. Well, if I live that long and all that kind of stuff.
You don't really have a choice, then, do you?